Brilliance Audio presents the unabridged recording of Blood Tide by Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson, performed by Jim Dale. Dear listener, a little while back we wrote a book called Peter and the Starcatchers. It told the story of what happened to Peter Pan before he was Peter Pan and how he became a boy who could fly. That book ended with Peter and his friends on an island with mermaids, pirates, and some natives who called themselves the Mollusk tribe. Right now, Peter is off having more adventures, and we're writing another book about those. But while he's gone, exciting things are happening to his friends and his enemies on the island. We decided it would be fun to tell some of those stories in a book for younger readers, like our own children. And so we wrote the story you're listening to now. We hope you enjoy listening to it as much as we enjoyed writing it. Sincerely, Dave Barry and Ridley Pearson. Chapter 1. Rolling Thunder. The determined rays of sunrise crept across the Mollusk Island jungle and found their way into a hollow tree stump, which led down into an underground hideaway. As the soft dawn light penetrated the darkness, it revealed 4 small boys asleep in hammocks. 2 of them, Tubby Ted and Thomas, were on their backs, snoring. Another, Prentice, was curled up against the slight chill in the morning air. The 4th boy, James, was on his stomach, his legs and arms sticking out to the sides, his posture matching his dream. He was flying. Just like Peter, who was off in England, visiting his starcatcher friend Molly Astor, having adventures, saving the world. In his dream, it was James having the adventures, not Peter. He soared like an eagle as swords clanged and cannons rumbled and boomed below. It all seemed so real, especially the rumbling of the cannons. Suddenly, James's eyes flicked open. He wasn't dreaming. The rumbling was real. The boy's underground hideaway was shaking. Clods of dirt and chunks of lava were falling from the ceiling and walls. His hammock was swinging the way hammocks swing on ships. "Wake up!" shouted James, clambering out of his hammock. "Wake up!" Prentice uncurled. Tubby Ted snorted himself awake. Thomas grunted, wiped some drool from his chin, and sat up, immediately falling out of his hammock. Ordinarily, this would have made the others laugh. But the whole hideaway was shaking now, and the deep rumbling sound was everywhere, all around them, terrifyingly loud. "What's happening?" shouted Tubby Ted. "I've no idea," replied James, "but we have to get out of here." He started toward the stick ladder that led up to the stump hole, but staggered and fell, the movement of the floor making it almost impossible to walk. As Tubby Ted tried to climb from his hammock, one of the pegs holding it up pulled loose from the vibrating wall. The hammock dropped, and Ted plummeted to the dirt floor. As the 4 boys struggled to stand, water began seeping and then gushing through one of the walls. The hideaway was flooding. On hands and knees, all 4 boys scrambled for the ladder. Thomas reached it and managed to get up to the stump. He shoved it aside. Blinding sunlight streamed inside. Whatever was causing the horrible noise, it wasn't thunder. Thomas climbed out, followed by Tubby Ted and Prentice. James was last up the ladder, and as he climbed, the earth shook so ferociously that the ladder snapped in 2. Thomas caught James's hands and, with the help of the other boys, managed to pull him out of the hole. Beneath their feet, the ground was heaving and buckling. Overhead, the massive trees were swaying violently. The deep rumble seemed to be coming from everywhere. "It's an earthshake," Thomas said. "Earthquake," Prentice corrected. A dozen yards away, a massive tree toppled with a loud crash. Then another came down, this one even closer to the boys. The jungle seemed to be coming apart before their eyes. A palm tree crashed to the ground, flinging its coconut sideways. One struck Tubby Ted and knocked him to the ground. As the boys helped up Tubby Ted, James shouted, "To the beach! We've got to get away from the trees!" Staggering and stumbling on the heaving ground, dodging falling trees and branches, the boys ran down a jungle path toward the water. They could see that the sea, usually calm, was wild this morning, with huge waves surging toward shore. Suddenly, just as the boys reached the beach, the rumbling and shaking stopped. They turned and looked back at the jungle. It was a tangled mass of fallen and leaning trees. For a few seconds there was no sound except that of the waves sliding up the sand. And then, in the distance, they heard a haunting sound, like a mournful trumpet. It was the sound of a conch shell, the signal used by the mollusc tribe, the native people who had given the island its name. The molluscs were friends of the boys, protecting them from Captain Hook and his pirates, who lived on the other side of the island. The boys recognized the signal. It was the call to meet at the mollusc village. The boys started trotting down the beach toward the sound. The trot turned into a run as another tremor began to shake the beach, almost turning the sand underfoot into liquid. The ocean waves became thundering mountains of water, crashing onto the shore as if determined to wash the island away forever. Chapter 2. Something Bit Me. The ground stopped shaking just as the boys reached the mollusc village. Within a few minutes, the sea was also calm. But the mollusc chief, Fighting Prawn, insisted that the boys remain inside the village walls, along with most of the tribe, while he and some of the elders inspected the island. They returned a few hours later to report that, other than toppling many trees, the earthquake appeared to have caused little serious damage. It had, however, made a soggy mess of the boys' underground hideaway. Fighting Prawn invited the boys to sleep in a hut in the village while their home was drying out. The boys accepted the offer readily. They liked being close to their friends, Shining Pearl and little Scallop, daughters of the chief. They also appreciated the mollusc's cooking, fish, wild pig, and other treats. When the boys got their own food, they tended to eat whatever was lying around, which meant, on many days, they ate coconut for breakfast, lunch, and supper. To repay their hosts for their hospitality, the boys spent most of the next day helping the molluscs clear the fallen trees and branches that had blocked many of the paths through the jungle. When the work was done, the boys, along with Shining Pearl and little Scallop, headed down to the lagoon to cool off with an afternoon swim. Prentice was the first to emerge from the jungle onto the beach. As soon as he saw the water, he stopped so quickly that Thomas, who was right behind and in a hurry to go swimming, bumped into him. "Hey, watch out," said Thomas. "Look at the water," said Prentice, pointing. Thomas looked, and his mouth opened in surprise. "It's the wrong colour," he said. Now the other children, emerging from the jungle, saw it too. The lagoon, usually a clear, brilliant, sunlit blue, was a murky, reddish colour, like rust. "What's happening to the lagoon?" said Tubby Ted, addressing the question to Shining Pearl, who had lived on the island the longest. "I don't know," said Shining Pearl. "I've never seen it look like this before." "Me either," said little Scallop. "Maybe the earthquake did it," suggested James. "Stirred up the mud on the bottom." "Maybe," said Shining Pearl, frowning, "although there isn't much mud in the lagoon, is there?" "No," admitted James, "there isn't." His eyes drifted out to the big rock in the lagoon. It was known as Mermaid Rock because the mermaids often could be seen sunning themselves on it. James saw 3 of them out there. But they weren't lying on the rock. They were in the water next to it, with only their heads visible. The sun was behind them, so he couldn't make out their faces. He waved, but the mermaids, normally friendly and outgoing, did not wave back. James started to wonder about that, but his thoughts were interrupted by Thomas. "Are we going swimming, then?" he said, starting toward the water. "Do you think we should?" said Prentice, aiming his question mostly at James, who was the leader of the boys when Peter was away. "I dunno," said James. "Maybe we should ask Fighting Prawn." "What for?" said Thomas, who had reached the lagoon and was starting to wade into the murky water. "Are you afraid?" "No, I'm not afraid," said James, reddening and glancing at Shining Pearl. "Then come on," said Thomas. He took 2 steps and dove into the water. He surfaced a few yards farther out, shook the water from his hair, and shouted, "It's fine!" James hesitated. He didn't like the looks of the water, but he was hot, and he certainly didn't want anybody, especially Shining Pearl, to think he was not brave. "All right, then," he said, walking toward the water. In a minute, all 6 children were splashing and laughing in the lagoon. Despite its unusual appearance, the water felt as refreshing as ever. The children quickly forgot their concerns. Gradually their frolicking took them from knee-high water to waist-high, and then deeper. "Let's race to Mermaid Rock!" shouted Thomas. James looked out toward the rock. It was empty. The 3 mermaids he'd seen earlier were gone. He was about to say something, but the race was already on. Thomas, a fine swimmer, was stroking swiftly through the water toward the rock, with the other children following as fast as they could. James, determined not to be the last to reach the rock, dove toward the rock and began swimming. He had taken 3 strokes when he heard the scream. He thrust himself as high out of the water as he could and scanned the area ahead. Another scream. It was coming from Thomas. "My leg!" he shouted. "Something bit me!" James began swimming toward Thomas as fast as he could. "Help!" shouted Thomas. "It's—" As James watched in horror, Thomas's head disappeared below the surface. "What's happening?" shouted Prentice from somewhere off to James's right. "Where's Thomas?" "Get back to the beach!" shouted James. "Tell the others!" Flailing his arms furiously, James reached the spot where Thomas had disappeared. He took a breath and dove down. In the murky water he could not see far, but he caught sight of something beneath him. It was Thomas's pale face, looking up toward him, eyes wide in fright. He was reaching up. With 2 thrusts of his arms, James dove down close enough to grab Thomas's hands. James changed direction and thrust upward, trying to pull Thomas to the surface. But something was holding his friend down. James's lungs burned. He couldn't stay down much longer. James saw a shape flash past him, diving deep. Shining Pearl. She was a superb swimmer, better than any of the boys. She dove down toward Thomas's legs. There was a swirl of motion, and suddenly Thomas was free. As James lunged toward the surface, pulling Thomas with him, he saw some shapes flash past. He caught a glimpse of flowing blonde hair and a long, graceful green tail. His head broke the surface and he gulped air as he yanked up Thomas next to him, gasping and coughing. A second later, Shining Pearl's head appeared. "Get him to the shore!" she shouted. "It's the mermaids!" Before James could say anything, Pearl was diving down again. James felt something cold grab his leg. He shouted and kicked as hard as he could. Whatever it was, let go. Holding Thomas with one arm and stroking furiously with the other, James swam toward shore. When his feet could feel sand, he stood and put Thomas's arm over his shoulder. The 2 of them stumbled out of the shallow water and onto the beach. Thomas lay on the sand, coughing and spitting up water. Prentice, Tubby Ted, and little Scallop ran to them. "What happened?" said Prentice. "I don't know," said James. Shining Pearl said, "Wait! Where is Shining Pearl?" "Here she comes," said little Scallop. They looked out and saw Shining Pearl swimming hard toward them, pausing every few strokes to flail her arms at something behind her. She reached the shallow water and began to run. Behind her a mermaid's head rose from the water, then another, then a third. Their normally lovely faces were twisted in anger. For a moment they hissed and snarled, revealing their sharp mermaid teeth. Then, with a flash of green tails, they turned and disappeared beneath the lagoon's murky surface. Shining Pearl stumbled ashore. "Are you all right?" asked James. "Yes," she gasped. "What about Thomas?" "I'm all right, I think," Thomas said. "One of them bit my leg." He pointed to his right leg, where there was a ring of bright red tooth marks. "What on earth got into them?" said James. "They've never done anything like this." "No," said Shining Pearl, gazing out at the lagoon. "They haven't." "So, what should we do?" said Tubby Ted. "We should tell Father," said Little Scallop. "Yes," agreed Shining Pearl, "and right away." The 6 children trotted up the beach and into the jungle. James was last in line. As he reached the jungle's edge, he looked back at the lagoon. Once again, there were 3 heads in the water next to Mermaid Rock. James could not make out the mermaids' faces, but there was no doubt in his mind that they were watching him. Chapter 3. Kettle Point. At first, Fighting Prawn did not believe the children. "The mermaids have always been friendly," he said. "Are you sure it wasn't a fish that attacked you?" He smiled in a way that made Shining Pearl very angry. She hated it when her father didn't take her seriously. "Father, I know what a fish looks like," she said. "Do you know any fish that leaves bite marks like those?" She pointed at Thomas's leg. Fighting Prawn bent down and inspected the rows of red marks. He nodded, frowning. "You're right," he said. "That's not a fish bite." Shining Pearl made a sound. "The teeth didn't break the skin," said Fighting Prawn. "Are you all right, Thomas?" "I'm fine, sir," said Thomas, adding in his bravest voice, "It was nothing." "No," said Fighting Prawn. "It was something, and I mean to find out what." He rose and ordered a scouting party of 4 warriors to go to Mermaid Lagoon and see what the mermaids were up to. Under no circumstances, he told them, were they to go into the water. "That goes for you children as well," he said. "You're to stay away from the lagoon." "But it's hot," said Prentice. "Can't we swim somewhere else?" The other children, including Thomas, nodded. It was hot. "What about Kettle Point?" said Little Scallop. This was a point near Skull Rock where a hot spring bubbled from the ground. There was a fine beach there. "Oh, Father," said Shining Pearl, "can we go to Kettle Point? There's no mermaids there." Fighting Prawn considered this. "Well, I suppose so," he said, "if you're careful." The children nodded vigorously. "While you're there," said Fighting Prawn, "see what damage the earthquake did on that side of the island." "Like a scouting party," said Prentice. "Yes," said Fighting Prawn, "you'll be a scouting party." Happy with their new mission, the children set off toward Kettle Point. As they neared the beach, Tubby Ted spotted a mango tree and left the trail in search of a snack. As he approached the tree, he suddenly stopped. "Psst!" he called back to the others. "No thanks, not hungry," said James. "Shh!" hissed Ted. He motioned for the others to come quietly. They formed a single file and crept through the jungle toward Ted. As they reached the mango tree, they heard what he'd heard. Voices. Beyond the tree, the jungle gave way to beach grass, where lizards scampered. Beyond that lay the sparkling grey volcanic sand that covered the shore near Skull Rock. Small waves lapped at the beach near a small spit of land where a circle of rocks surrounded a series of steaming pools. Kettle Point. But it was to the line of crashing surf out at the reef, well past Kettle Point, where Ted now pointed. The children looked there and saw where the voices were coming from. "Pirates," said Shining Pearl. 6 of Captain Hook's ragged men, who normally did not venture to this part of the island, were wading in the surf, snatching up objects being carried ashore by the waves. 2 of them were struggling with a large hatch cover. "A shipwreck," said James. Ted nodded enthusiastically. The pirates were carrying the shipwreck debris onto the beach, where they had made a stack of wood, pulleys, rope, and other objects. "What are they going to do with it?" said Prentice. "They'll use it in their fort," said James, "or let it dry and burn it. Pirates are clever." "Look," said Shining Pearl, "over there." 3 of the pirates had gathered around a small wooden keg. They appeared to be quite excited about it, waving the others over to see. The others came over, and they too celebrated the find. "What do you suppose it is?" said Tubby Ted. "We need to get closer," said Thomas. Shining Pearl shook her head. "We're not supposed to go near the pirates," she said. "She's right," said James. "What?" said Thomas. "Are you afraid?" "Of course I'm not," snapped James, his face reddening. "Well, then let's have a look," said Thomas. James hesitated. "I think I know what it is," said Ted. He pointed toward the pirates. One of them had hoisted the keg onto his shoulder and was lugging it up the beach, with the others following. "What?" said James. "They had kegs like that on the ship," said Ted. "Remember?" James frowned. "Next to the cannons," said Ted. "Powder," James said. "Black powder," Ted said proudly. "That's why they're so excited." "That's dangerous," Shining Pearl said. "We don't know it's black powder," said Thomas. "We need to get closer." The pirate carrying the keg was heading up the beach toward the jungle, with the others right behind. "Let's follow," said Thomas. "We need to tell Father," said Shining Pearl. "No time," said Thomas. "But we came over here to swim," reminded little Scallop. "I'm going," said Thomas. "Who's with me?" James bit his lower lip, then reluctantly said, "I'm in." Shining Pearl scolded him with her eyes. "If it is black powder," James told her, "it's important we know what they're up to. These are pirates, after all." She sighed and said, "All right. You'd get lost without me anyway." The others all nodded. They'd go as a group. With Thomas leading the way, they plunged into the jungle. Shining Pearl was second in line. She glanced over her shoulder at James with a look that said what they were both thinking. We should not be doing this. Chapter 4. A Gift from the Sea Gods. The children trotted along the jungle path as quietly as they could, trying to stay just out of sight of the pirates. The pirates made the job easier by not looking behind them. They were too excited about the wooden keg they'd found in the shipwreck debris. After a half hour, the pirates stopped for a rest. James crouched and hand-signalled the other children to slip into the jungle so as not to be seen. Ted stepped right into a sticky web and fought the gooey silk off his face as an enormous spider dangled in front of his eyes. If James had not clapped a hand over Ted's mouth, half the island might have heard him cry out. James and Thomas seized the opportunity to sneak closer to the pirates, hoping to determine the contents of the keg. But just as they drew near, the pirates rose from their resting places and took off again. The children scrambled to catch up and were soon following at a safe distance once more, but with no better idea of what it was they were following. They came to Clear Creek, which was running higher than usual. The pirates crossed it carefully, taking pains to keep the keg as dry as possible. When the pirates had disappeared into the jungle on the other side, the children approached the creek. Thomas stepped right into the rushing water and was almost carried away by the strong current, but he caught his balance and, half swimming, managed to make it across. James and the others stopped at the edge. "Past here is pirate territory," James called across. "I thought you wanted to know what was in the keg," answered Thomas. "Are you afraid?" James's ears burned. "Course not," he said. "Then come on," said Thomas. "We should tell Father," Shining Pearl said. "Yes," agreed James, looking across at Thomas. "But it is important to know what's in that keg." "I'm staying here," said Prentice. "Me too," said Ted, eyeing the churning water. James and Shining Pearl looked at each other, then at Thomas across the creek. Shining Pearl sighed and turned to Prentice, Ted, and little Scallop. "Don't you dare say anything to Father until we're back," she said. "Promise?" "Promise," they answered together. Shining Pearl eased into the roiling water and made her way across, struggling to keep her balance. She'd never seen the water this high. Thomas offered her a hand on the other side, pulling her up to dry ground. James followed across a moment later. "We won't be long," James called across to Ted, Prentice, and little Scallop. "Wait for us at the hut, and whatever you do, don't go near the lagoon." Turning away from the creek, James, Thomas, and Shining Pearl set off into the jungle. After a mile of fast walking, they came to the edge of the clearing where the pirates had built their fort. It looked as though a strong wind might blow it down, but in fact it had weathered some ferocious storms. The uneven wall, made of driftwood and palm tree trunks lashed together with vine, met at a large reinforced gate. At the moment the gate was open, though it could be closed quickly in case of an attack by Mr. Grin, the giant crocodile who always lurked nearby. Peering through the jungle leaves, the children could see past the open gate into the compound. They saw fish drying on a rack and a small fire wearing a grey hat of spiralling smoke, but no people. Needing a better view, they crept through the jungle to a spot nearer the wall, where they climbed a massive vine-covered tree high enough so that they could see into the compound. There they saw the pirates with the keg gathered outside a ramshackle shack. As they watched, a tall, thin man with a hard face and a vast moustache emerged from the shack. He stepped into the sunlight, shielding his eyes with the stump of an arm, at the end of which was a sword fashioned into a hook. This was Captain Hook, who had once been the most feared pirate on the seas. He looked at the keg with piercing black eyes. "What's this?" he snarled. "A bit of treasure, Captain," said one of the men named Herky. "From a shipwreck." The other 5 pirates nodded in agreement. "What kind of treasure?" said Hook. Herky spun the keg around so Hook could see something written on its side. His eyes lit up, and he very nearly managed to smile. Clearly he was pleased, but from the tree the children couldn't see what it was that Hook had read on the side of the keg. "Washed ashore at Kettle Point," said Herky. "We snatched it up before them molluscs could get it." "A gift from the sea gods," said Hook. "Have you tested it?" Herky shook his head. "We bung it here straight aways," he said. "Pull the bung," ordered Hook. Herky and another man used a rock and a long nail to dislodge a cork-like piece of wood in the top of the keg. Herky lifted the keg and carefully poured something into Hook's outstretched hand. The group of pirates parted as Hook walked toward the smouldering fire. He held his hand out into the curl of smoke, looked up at his men, and then opened his fist. The fire flashed a brilliant white. The pirates jumped back as a thick twist of black smoke rose into the air. All but Hook, who stood over the fire, his hatchet face widened by a smile, revealing twin rows of brown, crooked teeth. "Now this," he said, glittering dark eyes on the rising smoke, "this changes everything." Chapter 5. Flaming Hand Wades In. Flaming Hand could stand the heat no longer. He was one of 4 mollusc warriors assigned to watch the lagoon under the blazing summer sun. By the middle of the day, you could cook a fish just by laying it on a rock. Fighting Prawn had warned his men not to swim in the lagoon, but Flaming Hand was never one to follow orders precisely. He'd been given his name after playing with fish oil too close to the fire. He was thinking that he wouldn't have to swim to cool off, just wade in knee-deep. How could some fish girl hurt a mollusk warrior, anyway? Determined to cool off, he stepped into the cloudy water. He could feel the eyes of the other 3 warriors squatting in the shade of the palm trees, watching him closely. Suddenly, Flaming Hand made a terrified face and sank into the water, screaming. The other warriors leaped to their feet and ran toward the water. only to stop in disgust when Flaming Hand rose to his feet, laughing. They had fallen for his prank. Flaming Hand waded a bit deeper. The water was murky but refreshingly cool. He lowered himself until the water was up to his neck. He looked toward the shore, smiling to let the others know how good the water felt. Suddenly the 3 men on the shore were shouting at him to get out. They pointed frantically at the water behind him. Flaming Hand nodded and smiled. He figured they were trying to trick him, as he had tricked them. But he wasn't going to fall for it. He didn't turn around. Instead, he waved at them, laughing. Then he heard a splash behind him, and his laugh became a scream as he felt needle-sharp teeth sink into his leg. Chapter 6. The Warriors' Council. Shining Pearl and Little Scallop both noticed it at the same time, a gentle snoring sound from just outside the hut. Their mother had fallen asleep. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. This was their chance to sneak out and eavesdrop on the warrior council. The girls were being punished. When they'd returned with the boys to the mollusc camp, they expected to be praised for finding out about the pirates and their mysterious barrel. Instead, Fighting Prawn had been furious at them for following the pirates. He wasn't interested in the barrel. He said it was probably just grog, which pirates loved to drink. Shining Pearl and James tried to argue that what they saw was powder, not liquid, but Fighting Prawn wouldn't listen. His mind was on other problems. He ordered Shining Pearl and Little Scallop to spend the rest of the day in the hut, weaving mats. Then he went off to the Warrior Council, a meeting of the mollusk warriors called by Fighting Prawn to discuss the mermaid attacks. Children were not allowed at the Warrior Council, but Shining Pearl and Little Scallop wanted badly to find out what was going on. They tiptoed out of the hut, past their dozing mother. They sneaked around several other huts, ducked through the fish-drying racks, and came up behind the warrior lodge. There they found a half-dozen other children, all boys who had also ignored the rules so they could listen in on the council. Peering through cracks in the lodge's stick walls, they saw 24 men gathered in a semicircle, facing Fighting Prawn. He wore the chief's crown, a jagged piece of rare blue coral encrusted with hard rock, what the foreigners called diamonds, as well as some sea urchins and dried fish eyes. The largest eye, the size of a fist, was centered on Fighting Prawn's forehead. As his daughters watched through the crack, Fighting Prawn tapped a stick on a conch shell, indicating the council was starting. "As you know," he said, "the mermaids have attacked again. This time the victim was Flaming Hand. His legs were bitten badly in the lagoon. He will recover, but this is the second time the mermaids have attacked. I called this council so we can discuss how we will respond." A warrior rose to his feet. This was Snapping Turtle, Flaming Hand's older brother, known for his temper. "What is there to discuss?" he said. "Mollusks have been attacked. A mollusk warrior's blood has been spilled." "A mollusk warrior who was in the lagoon against my orders," said Fighting Prawn. "So what?" said Snapping Turtle in a defiant tone, rarely, if ever, used to address Fighting Prawn. "It's our island. It's our lagoon. We can't allow these she-fish to decide where we go. I say we spear them all." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the warriors. Heads nodded. Fighting Prawn stared at the warriors until they fell silent. "I agree that we must respond," he said, "but not that we must kill the mermaids. We have lived next to them for some time now. They have helped us. They have been our friends and allies. Something has gone wrong, yes, but nobody has died. So let us first try to solve the problem in a peaceful manner." "Peaceful," said Snapping Turtle. "They attacked my brother and you want to do nothing?" "No," said Fighting Prawn. "I want to find out what is causing this. I want to talk to the leader of the mermaids, the one called Teacher." "Talk," said Snapping Turtle. He spat on the dirt floor, drawing a gasp from the other warriors, who had never seen such a lack of respect for the chief. For a long few seconds, Fighting Prawn was silent. When he spoke, it was with a voice that did not allow for disagreement. "Yes," he said, "talk, and then, if necessary, action. But first I will speak with teacher, and you will do nothing until I say otherwise. Do you understand?" Snapping Turtle glared at the chief and said nothing. The hut was silent, the warriors still as statues. "Do you understand?" Snapping Turtle nodded slowly once. "I understand," he said softly. "I understand that mollusk blood has been shed." He held out his hand, showing the others that he held a piece of lava in his palm. He clenched his fist, crumbling the lava. Dust slipped through his fingers and fell to the floor. He blew the remaining dust from his hand, then turned to the seated warriors and said, "I don't know about the rest of you, but I believe that when we are attacked, we fight back. I will avenge my brother." "You will do," said Fighting Prawn slowly, "what your chief tells you to do." By way of answer, Snapping Turtle turned and walked out of the lodge. 4 other warriors stood and followed him out. Fighting Prawn watched them go. Then he spoke with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Snapping Turtle is upset because of his brother," he said. "I understand that, but he and the others who left must be disciplined for the disrespect they have shown this council." The warriors nodded, and Fighting Prawn continued, "For now, however, I must deal with the threat to our tribe posed by the mermaids. I will go to see teacher with my sons." Again the warriors nodded. Fighting Prawn tapped the conch shell again, indicating that the warrior council was over. After the council broke up, Fighting Prawn headed down the path to the Mermaid lagoon, followed by his sons, Bold Abalone and Sturdy Conch. The children who had been eavesdropping on the council scurried away from the warrior lodge so as not to be caught. Shining Pearl and Little Scallop ducked behind a hut. They heard voices and, peeking around a corner, saw Snapping Turtle walking past with the other 4 warriors who had walked out. "I don't care if he's the chief," Snapping Turtle was saying. "He's an old man, and he has lost his fighting spirit." The others nodded. "He wants to talk," continued Snapping Turtle. "But I say the time for talk is past. The sheefish have attacked us twice. I say we fight back now." The others muttered in agreement. With Snapping Turtle leading the way, they plunged into the jungle in the direction of the Mermaid lagoon. "This is terrible," Shining Pearl whispered to Little Scallop. "They're going to kill the mermaids. We must warn Father." "We should warn Teacher, too," said Little Scallop, "if we can find her before Snapping Turtle does." "We'll get James and the others to help us," said Shining Pearl. The 2 girls set off running as fast as they could, hoping desperately that it would be fast enough. Chapter 7. The Mermaid's Strike. Fighting Prawn and his 2 sons, Bold Abalone and Sturdy Conch, strode onto the hot, sunlit beach of Mermaid Lagoon. The sons carried a canoe which they set down at the water's edge. They were about to climb in when Fighting Prawn stopped them. "I must go alone," he said. "If the mermaids see 2 warriors and a chief, they might think we mean to fight." "They might think that anyway," said Bold Abalone, gesturing back up the beach. Fighting Prawn looked and saw that the warriors who'd been in the council had gathered at the edge of the jungle, armed with spears. As he watched, a smaller group emerged from the jungle farther up the beach, Snapping Turtle and the other 4 warriors. They too held spears, and they were clearly planning to use them. Fighting Prawn realized that he was close to losing control of all his warriors. He climbed into the canoe. "It's too dangerous," said Sturdy Conch. "Let us go with you." "No!" said Fighting Prawn, in a tone of voice that his sons had never disobeyed and never would. "Now give me a push before Snapping Turtle and the others make this situation worse than it already is." His sons gave the canoe a shove, and Fighting Prawn shot out into the murky lagoon. He had never seen the water so cloudy. He slipped the paddle into the water and expertly propelled the canoe toward the center of the lagoon. Ahead, he saw several mermaids on the rocks by Mermaid Island. Even at a distance, Fighting Prawn could tell something was wrong. The mermaids' faces, usually happy and welcoming, were grim. Their eyes were narrowed to suspicious slits. Fighting Prawn stopped paddling, raised his arm, and waved. The mermaids did not wave back. One of them slid swiftly off the rock into the water. She flipped her powerful tail and was gone. Fighting Prawn scanned the rocks, looking for Teacher, the mermaid leader. He had dealt with her before and felt that if he could just speak to her, he could get to the bottom of the problem. Once again, he started paddling toward the island. Suddenly, he spotted twin disturbances in the lagoon's calm surface, heading directly for him. He glanced over his shoulder at his sons on shore. They stood at the water's edge, their full attention focused on him. Fighting Prawn wondered if he'd made a mistake leaving them behind. The two mermaids struck. They hit the canoe with tremendous force, both on the right side, clearly intending to flip it. It was only through great quickness and balance that Fighting Prawn managed to shift his weight enough to keep the small craft from going over. He grabbed the sides, lowered himself into the bottom, and braced for the next attack. It came quickly, the two mermaids hitting on the left side of the canoe. Again, the canoe rolled sharply, and this time Fighting Prawn couldn't prevent it from taking on water. Before Fighting Prawn could bail it out, the mermaids hit again, and then again, each time rocking the canoe violently, so that more water poured in. Fighting Prawn heard shouting from his sons and the others on shore, but he was too busy fighting for his life to answer. He raised the paddle, watching as another disturbance in the water streaked toward the canoe. He saw a flash of green tail, a stream of blonde hair. He brought the paddle down like an axe. He heard a muted scream. Bubbles churned the water. The other mermaid attacked from the same side, but Fighting Prawn was expecting it. Again he swung the paddle down. Again he heard a cry of pain. For a moment he had driven off the attackers. He began paddling as hard as he could toward shore, grateful that the canoe, though carrying a foot of water, was still upright. As he paddled, he glanced back over his left shoulder, then his right. More water streaks were coming toward him. The mermaids had not given up. Again and again he slashed at the water with his paddle, driving them away. Again and again they came at him, sometimes getting close enough to rock the canoe. But now Fighting Prawn had help. His sons had gone back for, and then launched, a second canoe, and were paddling furiously his way. They reached him in seconds, and were lunging at the mermaids with the sharp tips of their spears. One of the mermaids raised her head and tried to bite the spear, revealing a frightening row of razor-sharp, pointed teeth. She snapped the spear in two. But with the help of his sons, Fighting Prawn was soon able to reach the safety of shallow water. The mermaids, hissing in anger, had to turn away. Fighting Prawn and his sons dragged the canoes onto the beach. The other warriors, including Snapping Turtle's group, gathered around them. Fighting Prawn wiped the sweat from his brow and thanked his sons for coming to his rescue. Then he turned to face the others. Snapping Turtle stepped forward. "Are you done with talking?" he said. "Are you ready to fight back?" Fighting Prawn was silent for a moment. He looked at Mermaid Island. He could see a half-dozen mermaids sitting on their rocks, watching. Then he turned back to the warriors. "Yes," he said, "we will fight back." A cheer went up, echoing across the lagoon to the watching mermaids. Chapter 8. Borrowing a Canoe. Shining Pearl and little Scallop found the boys waiting just outside the village walls. "What's happening?" said James. "What did they decide?" "It's awful," said Shining Pearl. "They're going to attack the mermaids." "And kill them," said little Scallop, tears in her eyes. "I'm not surprised," said Thomas. "After all, the mermaids have gone mad, attacking everyone who goes into the water." James nodded. "But still," he said, "they've been our friends. They've helped us more than once, and saved Peter's life." The boys all nodded at that. The mermaids had indeed been very good friends in the past. "Is there anything we can do?" said James. "We've got to stop this," said Shining Pearl. "How are you going to do that?" asked Ted. "If we can talk to Teacher," said Shining Pearl, "and tell her what's happening, maybe she can get the other mermaids to come to their senses." "But how do we get to Teacher?" said James. "In a canoe," said Shining Pearl. "But what about the mermaids?" said Ted, glancing nervously in the direction of the lagoon. "What if they attack the canoe?" "We'll bring extra paddles," said James. "Some of us can fight off the mermaids while the others paddle." Said Ted, "maybe one of us should stay on the beach to stand guard and signal if there's trouble." James looked at Ted and, with the slightest of smiles, said, "Good idea, Ted. Perhaps you could do that." "If you insist," said Ted, looking relieved. "Excuse me," said Prentice, "but has anyone considered the fact that we don't have a canoe?" "We're going to borrow one," said Shining Pearl. "We?" said Prentice. "You boys are," said Shining Pearl, "while little Scallop and I distract Father and the others." She explained her plan to the boys. A few minutes later they had taken up their positions. Thomas was crouched outside the wall around the mollusc village, peering through a crack at Fighting Prawn and his warriors. The other boys were hiding in the trees near where the molluscs kept their canoes. As Ted watched, Shining Pearl and little Scallop approached their father. Fighting Prawn was explaining how they would attack the mermaids' island. "Father," said Shining Pearl. He turned to face them, angry at the interruption. "What is it?" he said. "That barrel we told you about, the one the pirates found. I talked to James, and he's sure it wasn't grog. He says it must be gunpowder because of the way it burned when—" "Be quiet," said Fighting Prawn, furious at his daughter's behaviour. "Can you not see we are discussing a serious matter? I will deal with the pirates later. I will also deal with the two of you who have disappointed me deeply." His dark eyes glared at his daughters. Shining Pearl felt terribly guilty for deceiving her father this way, but she also was glad to note that the eyes of all the warriors were on her, which meant that they would not be looking through the open village gate to where the canoes were kept. She hoped that Thomas had noticed this as well. He had. Outside the wall, Thomas was waving his arm, the signal for the other boys to act. "There it is," said James. He and the others raced across the clearing and grabbed the first canoe. "The paddles!" James hissed at Ted, while he and Prentice flipped the canoe over and hoisted it above their heads. The boys trotted off toward the lagoon as fast as they could, while Ted followed, dragging 4 long paddles. Thomas joined them, taking hold of the canoe in the middle. "What did Fighting Prawn do to the girls?" asked James, huffing from the effort of carrying the canoe. "He sent them to their hut," huffed Thomas. Shining Pearl had expected this, but had assured the boys that she and little Scallop would escape quickly to join them at the lagoon. "Ted," said James, "after you leave the paddles by the lagoon, head up onto those rocks. We'll watch for you. If you raise 2 hands over your head, that means the warriors are coming. Your 2 arms held out straight at your side means everything's okay. The coast is clear." "Got it," huffed Ted. "But if the warriors are coming, what will you do about it?" "We have to hope we've found Teacher by then," said James, "and brought the mermaids to their senses." "But what if you haven't?" said Ted. "We will," said James grimly as the murky lagoon waters came into view. "We have to." Chapter 9. Bubbles Rising. The canoe left the beach behind as it glided under the rocky cliff where Ted stood as lookout. In the distance ahead lay Mermaid Island, but the children's attention was focused on the water as they watched anxiously for signs of mermaids. Suddenly little Scallop raised her arm and pointed. "Look!" she shouted. A bubbling wake had broken the surface of the murky lagoon. It was heading right at the canoe. "Brace yourself!" shouted Thomas, grabbing the canoe's edge. James and Prentice raised their paddles, prepared to strike. But just as the bubbling line was about to reach the canoe, the water exploded in front of it. The bubbles veered sharply to the right, away from the canoe. "It's Ted," said little Scallop, pointing at the rocky cliff. Ted waved down with his left hand. In his right he held a large rock. As the children watched, he took aim and heaved it. There was another big splash as the rock hit the lagoon just behind the trail of bubbles, which zoomed farther from the canoe. "Ted's quite good at throwing, isn't he?" said Shining Pearl, impressed. "He nearly hit that mermaid." The boys nodded. Prentice said, "He learnt that by flinging rocks to bring down coconuts. He's the best at that." "He's protecting us," James said. "Paddle, quickly." The children dug their paddles into the water, and the canoe shot forward. Several more mermaids tried to approach, but each time they were driven away by well-aimed rocks thrown by Ted, who trotted along the cliff above to keep up. The canoe was quickly approaching Mermaid Island. Ted, nearly out of range now, unleashed a volley of stones that splashed into the water around the canoe, except for one that thunked into the canoe hull. "Sorry," called Ted. "We're all right," James called back. "Nice work, Ted." On the cliff, Ted beamed with pride. "Look," said Shining Pearl. "There's Teacher." The mermaid leader was perched on a high rock next to the island. With her were 3 younger mermaids. Shining Pearl waved at Teacher, expecting to get a wave and a smile in return. Instead, Teacher's face remained grim. Instead of a wave, she raised her hand in an odd half-salute. "What was that?" said Prentice. "Maybe she wants us to go closer," said little Scallop. James frowned. He looked around at the water near the canoe. "Do you think we should?" he said. "Of course we should," said Shining Pearl. "We came out to talk to her, didn't we?" "Yes," said James, "but she's acting odd. And those other mermaids back there were coming after us." "But Teacher's not," countered Shining Pearl, "and Ted has driven the others off." The canoe drifted forward a few more feet toward the island. Teacher and the 3 younger mermaids were still watching, unmoving, their faces blank. "I don't like this," said James. "Teacher," Shining Pearl called, "we need to speak with you." A flicker of emotion crossed Teacher's face, but she said nothing. The canoe drifted closer. "Please," said Shining Pearl, "it's important." No response from Teacher. The canoe kept drifting. "I don't like this at all," said James. "Let's at least be ready to paddle." "Good idea," said Prentice. He, James, and Shining Pearl picked up their paddles and put them in the water. Suddenly there was a shout from Ted on the cliff. "Watch out!" The children turned to look, and as they did, all 4 paddles were yanked violently out of their grips and pulled straight down into the murky lagoon. Gone. "Let's get out of here," shouted James. "Use your hands." He and Prentice started to paddle with their hands, but quickly yanked them back out of the water to avoid being bitten by the needle-like teeth of the hissing mermaids who now surrounded the canoe. On the cliff, Ted was shouting and hurling rock after rock as hard as he could, but it was no use. The canoe was out of range. The children could do nothing but hang on in terror as the canoe, propelled by the mermaids around them, shot toward the island and Teacher. As it reached the island, the right side was suddenly yanked under water, sending the children screaming into the lagoon. Hissing mermaids appeared from everywhere now, grabbing the children and dragging them onto the rocks, just below where Teacher sat. "Please!" Shining Pearl shouted at Teacher. "Please stop! We just want to talk to you, please!" For a moment, Shining Pearl thought she saw something in the mermaid leader's eyes, but Teacher said nothing. She stared down silently as the mermaids bound the children's hands behind their backs, using rope made of braided seaweed. They lay on the rocks, helpless, surrounded by snarling mermaids baring their sharp teeth. "What are they going to do to us?" whispered Prentice. "I don't know," whispered James. "We've got to get out of here," whispered Shining Pearl. "Father will be coming soon with the warriors to attack. If the mermaids see them coming, there's no telling what they'll do to us." Little Scallop leaned over and buried her face in her big sister's shoulder, sobbing. Shining Pearl looked at James and again whispered, "We've got to get out of here." James nodded, looking at the ring of hostile she-fish surrounding them. They definitely had to get out of there. But how? Chapter 10. A Strategic Genius. Captain Hook stood on the top of the mountain ridge that ran along the centre of Mollusk Island, dividing it into two. From here, he could look down the mountain side he had just climbed and see the pirate fort which sat in a clearing far below. Looking down the other side of the mountain, Hook could see the mollusc village, which sat in the flatland between the mountain and the sea. Hook's sharp sailor's eyes scanned the rugged green mountainside leading down to the mollusc village until he found what he was looking for. He turned to Smee, sitting on the ground puffing and red-faced from the climb. "Smee," said Hook, pointing. "Do you see that?" Smee heaved himself to his feet and squinted into the distance.
"The sea, Captain?"
he said. Hook sighed a deep sigh. "Smee," he said.
"What, Captain?"
"Do you really think," said Hook, his voice starting low but rising in volume, "that I would have us climb all the way up this mountain to show you the sea?" Smee frowned, thinking about it.
"I was wondering about that, Captain,"
he said.
"Because there's sea on our side of the island too. If you want, I can show you."
Hook started to clap his hand to his forehead, but stopped himself. The last time he'd clapped his hand to his forehead, he had forgetfully used the hand with the hook on it and given himself a nasty cut. So instead, he rolled his eyes. "Smee," he said.
"Captain?"
"You are an idiot."
"Aye, Captain."
"Actually, you are far stupider than an idiot, Smee. Calling you an idiot is an insult to idiots."
"Aye, Captain."
"Now," said Hook, "what I want you to do is very carefully look where I'm pointing. I am not pointing at the sea, Smee. I am fully aware that, this being an island, I can see the sea in all directions. What I am pointing at, Smee, is the ravine that runs from the savages' village to a spot halfway up the side of the mountain. Do you see the ravine I mean, Smee?" Smee squinted.
"Aye, Captain,"
he said. "Good," said Hook. "Now, follow that ravine up the mountain with your eye. Do you see where it ends, about halfway up?"
"Aye, Captain."
"And what do you see at that spot?"
"Smoke, Captain."
"Good, Smee. And where is that smoke coming from?"
"A lava pit, Captain."
"Correct, Smee," said Hook. "And that is precisely what we need." Smee frowned.
"Captain,"
he said.
"there's lava pits on our side of the island, if we need one."
This was true. Mollusk Island was actively volcanic. There were 6 places where lava bubbled up from the mountainside, forming bubbling, smoking cauldrons, some of which overflowed, sending rivers of hot lava down to the sea.
"I know that's me," said Hook, "but this lava pit is in the perfect spot for my plan to get us off this wretched island."
Smee frowned.
"Begging the captain's pardon, but I don't see how." "Of course you don't," said Hook. "It takes a man of my strategic genius."
He tapped his forehead with his hand, making sure it was his non-hook hand.
"To think of a plan like this." "Aye, Captain."
"Now, pay close attention," said Hook, who had been thinking about this for hours and was eager to exhibit his brilliance to somebody, even Smee.
"What do we need to get off this wretched island?"
Smee frowned.
"A ship,"
he said.
"Good, Smee. A ship, or a boat. Now, who on this island has boats?"
Smee frowned again.
"The savages." "Excellent. So what we must do if we are to get off the island is take one of the savages' boats."
Smee looked concerned.
"With all due respect, Captain," he said, "I don't think they'll let us." "I know they won't let us, you idiot," said Hook. "That's why we're going to create a diversion." "A what?" said Smee. "A diversion. Something to distract them. And while they're paying attention to the diversion, we steal their boat." "I see," said Smee. "You do?" said Hook. "No," said Smee.
Hook sighed.
"The diversion," he said, "is lava, flowing down that ravine straight toward the savage village, destroying everything in its path, and ultimately turning their village to ashes."
Hook smiled at the thought. Smee squinted down the mountain.
"But, Captain," he said, "that lava doesn't flow down the hill. It just bubbles and smells bad." "That's all it does now," said Hook. "But we're going to change that with the keg." "The what?" said Smee. "The gunpowder, idiot." "Ah," said Smee, impressed.
Smee himself had forgotten all about the keg.
"We blow out the side of the lava pit," said Hook. "The lava surges down the mountainside toward the village, destroying everything."
Hook described this scene almost sadly, because he would not get to see it.
"And while the savages are trying to save their village, we help ourselves to their biggest and finest boat, maybe 2 boats. And by the time the savages realize what happened, we're far away."
Smee said nothing. He could only gaze in awe, overcome by his captain's brilliance. Hook saw the admiration in Smee's eyes and basked in it for a few moments. Then he turned and started down the mountainside toward the pirate fort.
"Let's go get that keg," he said, "and get off this wretched island."
Chapter 11. Movement on the Mountainside. Ted was frantic. He'd watched helplessly from the cliff as his friends had been captured by the mermaids and dragged behind some rocks out of his sight. He turned away from the cliff's edge and started running up Waterfall Hill, trying to get a better view. Every few steps he stopped, gasping for breath, and turned back to look for his friends, but they remained hidden from his sight. As Ted struggled up the steep hillside, troubling thoughts tumbled around his brain. Why had the mermaids captured his friends? And what could he do about it? Should he tell Fighting Prawn? But wouldn't that make the chief even angrier and put his friends more at risk? Sweat gushed down Ted's face as he climbed higher. He turned again and looked toward Mermaid Island. There! Finally he could see over the rocks and just make out the heads of his friends. They were seated, facing Teacher, who was perched on a rock with several other mermaids. The canoe had been dragged behind the rocks, hidden from the beach. Ted studied the scene for a minute. Nothing was happening. His friends appeared to be all right. For now. But what did the mermaids plan to do, and how would they react when the mollusks attacked? Ted cast a worried gaze to his right, toward the mollusk village. He saw no sign yet of the warriors, although he knew they would be keeping out of sight, approaching the lagoon under the cover of the jungle. Then, suddenly, Ted saw movement on the mountainside high above the village. He shaded his eyes with his hands, straining to see. Pirates! They were coming down from the mountain ridge that divided the island. Ted frowned. This was very odd. The pirates never came to the mollusk side of the island. He studied the line of pirates as they picked their way down the steep slope. There was Hook in the lead, and behind him was a man carrying... Ted squinted to get a better look. The gunpowder keg. Ted watched the pirates for several minutes. There was no question. They were carrying the keg down toward the mollusk village. But why? Ted wished more than anything that Peter was with him, or James, to help him figure out what the pirates were up to. Something bad, he was sure of that. He was also sure something should be done about it, but at the moment there seemed to be nobody who could do it, except Ted. But what exactly was he supposed to do? Chapter 12. Teacher Speaks. The 5 children sat with their backs against the hard rocks, looking up at Teacher, who was perched above them. The children sat as still as they could. They were surrounded by mermaids who watched them closely, hissing and baring their sharp teeth at the slightest movement. Teacher, normally in total command of Mermaid Island, did nothing to stop this. She seemed to be as afraid of the other mermaids as the children were. Shining Pearl thought Teacher looked sick. Her normally dark green tail was pale. Her face looked tired, her eyes sunk deep in their sockets. As Shining Pearl looked at Teacher, their gazes met, and for the first time since the children had been captured, Teacher spoke. "Are you all right?" she said, her voice cautious, almost a whisper. Several of the mermaids hissed. Teacher looked at them, and Shining Pearl could tell she was talking to them without using words. This was how mermaids communicated. The children called it eye-talking. Turning back to Shining Pearl, Teacher again said, "Are you all right? Answer quietly, and don't move." Shining Pearl, darting her eyes toward the other mermaids, said, "They can't understand us?" "Only I can speak English," Teacher said. "They have no idea what we're saying, and I'm still the one in charge, at least for now." She glanced around at the mermaid guards, who were listening with expressions of hostility and suspicion. "I don't know how much longer I can control them." "But what's happening?" asked Shining Pearl. "Why are they attacking my people? Why did they capture us?" "It's an illness," said Teacher. "A terrible disease. It has spread from one mermaid to another. It makes them angry and violent. They attack anything that swims or floats. They've even been attacking each other. I can control them some of the time, but it's getting harder. Several times I thought they were about to attack me." "But what's making it happen?" asked Shining Pearl. "And why hasn't it affected you?" "Because I was lucky enough to be out of the water when it started," said Teacher. "And when I realized what was happening, I stayed out of the water and avoided eating. I tried to tell the others, but it was too late." James, who, like the other children, had been listening intently, said, "What's wrong with the water?" Teacher nodded toward the lagoon. "Can't you see?" The children looked out at the water. "It's cloudier than usual," said James. "Sort of reddish," said Thomas. "We call it the blood tide," said Teacher. "We've seen it before in the warm months, but never in the lagoon. It turns the sea red and harms whatever swims in it.
We've always stayed away from it, but it caught us this time by coming into the lagoon." "We've seen it too," said Shining Pearl. "At least our fishermen have. It kills the fish and turtles. Birds too sometimes. The fishermen never keep fish killed by the blood tide, because if people eat it, it makes them sick too. But you're right, it never came into the lagoon before. Why is it here now?" "I don't know," said Teacher. "I've been sitting here asking myself that same question. If the blood tide doesn't go away soon, I don't know what will happen. My mermaids are getting sicker, and I can't last much longer without going into the water or eating." "I'm afraid that's not the only bad news," Shining Pearl said grimly. "What do you mean?" said Teacher. "Warriors are coming," said Shining Pearl. "What?" Shining Pearl told Teacher about her father's efforts to hold back his warriors, to make contact with Teacher, the attack on his canoe, and his decision to attack Mermaid Island. "They're going to attack any minute," she concluded. "We came out to warn you about it." "But that's terrible," said Teacher. "If only we could get word to him, explain about the blood tide sickness." "Ted's back on the island," said James. "Maybe we could signal him somehow." The children turned to look back over the rocks. The mermaid guards hissed at the movement, but Teacher was able to quiet them. "I think I see Ted," said little Scallop. "He's way up high above the cliff on Waterfall Hill." Teacher and the children looked up the hill and, one by one, spotted the tiny figure of Ted. "I don't know how we can signal him," said James. "If we yell, these mermaids are likely to attack us." Indeed, the mermaids were edging closer, hissing, clearly unhappy with all the conversation. "Hold on," said Prentice, his eyes on the hill. "Where's the waterfall?" "What?" said Shining Pearl. "The waterfall," said Prentice. "On Waterfall Hill." "Where is it?" The rest of them looked, and then gasped. Prentice was right. The waterfall that gave the hill its name, which usually splashed into the lagoon from the cliff's edge, wasn't there. "I don't understand," said little Scallop. "How could a waterfall be missing?" "The earthquake," said James. "It must have shifted the stream that fed the waterfall."
This is the end of disc number 1. Please continue listening on disc number 2.